Bad Ideas, a show where we look at misfires, mistakes, and miscalculations from all throughout history.
I'm Tony Southcott.
And I'm Albert Berg, and if you listened to last week, you heard me take a hatchet to the internet's favorite science wizard, Mr. Nikola Tesla. Well, this week, Tony has a little bit of a different thing that you guys might be a little more on board for. Take it away, Tony.
Well, this is actually going to be pretty similar in some ways because you have somebody that doesn't fully understand what's happening with current. Like, I know that Thomas Edison was a wizard with DC currents and everything, but you see a lot of arrogance leading to his inability to adapt to AC. And it's kind of an interesting story and similar to Tesla's in that he doesn't fully understand something, but is going to go pile driving ahead anyway. We're talking about Thomas Edison, noted inventor from Jersey, and his battle with AC power.
What is AC? What does AC stand for, Tony? I know the answer. I want you to understand, but I'm asking you as a podcaster who wants more information, what is this AC thing about?
AC is alternating current and DC is direct current. It's basically two different ways of delivering electricity. And basically, AC has some major advantages that we're going to get into, and DC is a more rudimentary system. Like, I'm trying to think of exactly, like, an analogy on how the difference works, whereas, like, I've always heard that DC just kind of flows in a direct line, whereas AC is kind of like if you filled a tube with marbles and they went back and forth very quickly.
That is relatively accurate. I would say AC is like a saw that goes back and forth, like a handsaw, and DC is like a saw that goes around in a circle, always cutting in the same direction.
Bandsaw action.
Yep.
Anyway, we're looking at a new era in America, one bathed with the glow of electric lights, appliances, and all the conveniences that electricity could bring. Houses were being retrofitted with miles upon miles of wire, sockets, and most importantly, mountains of Thomas Edison's light bulbs. In 1882, the Edison Illuminating Company would fill homes and businesses with a much safer 110-volt DC lights as opposed to the 3,000-volt arc lamps that were used to illuminate city streets and sometimes factories. Like, these were just brutally bright lights that buzzed a lot, created a lot of heat, and were very rarely in use because it just took so much power to keep them going. They were not practical for homes.
They also put off a lot of carbon. As someone who has experience with arc lights, they create like a smoke that builds up on anything around them.
Yeah, it's just an ugly form of light, and it's like it still has its purposes, but it's not very practical for anything that's residential. And now this all might sound like a wonderful idea, and at times it really was, but there was a bigger problem. DC power at these lower voltages could only be transferred around a mile in all directions. Because of the energy transfer known as line loss, electric energy was lost before it could reach its final destination, usually given off as heat energy. This meant that multiple power plants would have to be placed in the very center of cities and residential areas in order to serve the community. It could be like every mile you would need some sort of power station.
And to keep the analogy train going, line loss is essentially the friction of electricity. It's as if you sent energy to someone in the form of a car. If you want it to get to the end of the road going 30 miles an hour, you can't start it out going 30 miles an hour. It probably has to be going 50 miles an hour.
At the time, AC power was considered unsafe because of the sheer voltage power. When systems were developed to step down the voltage using transformers, when it was being wired into homes, AC all of a sudden became a much more viable source of power. Inventor and entrepreneur George Westinghouse saw the potential in this, understanding that the scale could be so much larger than DC lighting systems. By 1886, the Westinghouse Electric Company had built their first AC power system in Buffalo, New York. Edison watched as the Westinghouse Company and several others started to charge ahead. By 1887, just a few years after Edison had started to corner the market, Westinghouse had 68 power stations to 121 of Edison's. The war of currents had officially begun. It started small with patent disputes and go much bigger from there.
And is there any particular person, scientist, let's say, who would be well associated with AC power as a pro?
That would definitely be Nikola Tesla, and he actually worked for Edison for a little while.
So he did some good stuff too. It wasn't just the terrible things I said last week.
He did some amazing stuff, and there were a lot of other mathematicians that had a much broader understanding of AC power. It's interesting that it wasn't just Tesla doing that. He was just one of the ones that made like an AC dynamo that would actually work to convert this power properly. Tesla essentially solved this problem, but it would require switching to AC power, and that's why Edison did not end up giving him the $50,000 that he had promised him. And in 1890, you can imagine $50,000 is a pretty substantial sum of money.
Yes, I still wouldn't turn down $50,000, Tony.
Yeah, that's a pretty stout sum today. I didn't do any calculations on the interest there or on the inflation, but I imagine it's pretty hefty. This was kind of an ugly time for electricity, though, not just because of the competition between power companies, but the retrofitting of buildings without standards. Most cities had requirements to bury power lines for safety reasons, but New York and a few other places did not. Thousands of cables were draped between buildings, causing massive tangles of wire and blatant eyesores. You can actually still see this a lot in parts of China, where it's just a mess of wires going between buildings, and a lot of times things are just completely knotted up on these power poles. It is very ugly and very much not safe.
I think I've seen something similar when I've been to Mexico once or twice, and I saw people getting power from a bare wire by hooking, literally just having a metal hook attached to a wire that went to their house, and they just threw it up over the power line.
Yeah, that is some scary, scary stuff. Especially because we're going to be talking about differences in voltages here in a minute. Most of the wiring was put up by defunct companies and was simply abandoned, which led to the deterioration, and a lot of times those cables, whenever they started fraying and falling apart, would pull down other cables. A lot of these homes actually had people installing as many light sockets as possible too, so they were starting to get a lot of draw, and with the DC power systems, it wasn't a lot of current going into the house, but there were just so many with rudimentary bulbs and everything that it became kind of a fire hazard. These above-ground wires were also not protected from the elements, and when the Great Blizzard of 1888 hit New York, most of the city lost power for weeks. It was basically just a time where they didn't have any of the infrastructure set up for this. It's like they weren't building New York 50 years prior with electricity in mind, so there was just a lot of extra work that had to go into it.
Still not as bad as Puerto Rico, though.
Yeah, true.
These guys are still out. A lot of them.
It's like there's only so many Tesla batteries that can be installed in hospitals whenever everybody else needs the power. At this time, Edison saw the growth of AC power and felt that it was horribly irresponsible. It started with his concerns about the sheer voltage in the system, which he very well knew could kill someone. In a letter about the situation he wrote, "Just as certain as death, Westinghouse will kill a customer within 6 months after he puts a system of any size. He's got a new thing and it will require a great deal of experimenting to get it to work practically." Which this seems kind of counter to Edison's attitude, because he was not much of a theorist. He was more of a brute force a problem until you find a solution. So, the experimenting part really shouldn't get him down all that much. That was one of the things that Tesla and many other people had on him, was that they were able to use mathematical theorem to move ahead with some of their ideas, rather than just, try everything until you find something that works.
Now, I have a question about this that you may answer later in the podcast, Tony, but Tesla's talking about the dangers of this AC current because of the voltages. Was DC demonstrably safer at this point?
Yeah, and they actually did have a lot of demonstrations of that we're going to be talking about.
Okay.
The DC voltage that was going through a lines rarely exceeded more than 300 volts. So it was you could still hurt somebody severely, but it was a less of a problem. Although Edison would end up playing this up a lot in different sorts of propaganda, saying that more than 50 electricians had been killed by AC power. I think by 1890 he had put out some publications saying that, and in reality it was 2 people. And with electricity being so young, it was inevitable that there were going to be some accidents there.
I was going to say, I imagine at this point there probably have been 50 people killed by AC power.
Yeah, probably.
At least.
Probably just by the state.
Well,
we'll get to that
I was
as well.
thinking of electricians, but yes, that too.
While Edison held this belief, his staff, among them Nikola Tesla, tried to convince him that AC power was going to be the future. His sales team kept losing contracts and bids to AC power companies. Big part of this was because if you were in a rural area and you wanted to put in a power plant, you couldn't use a DC power plant. It just wasn't going to reach out to these farms or anything like that.
Essentially, every single farm would have to have its own power plant if you wanted to run on DC, right?
Yeah, you might be able to get 2 or 3 farms within a mile radius, but even then, that's a big if it's going to, and then you'd have to have them with their individual generators and everything. And I'm sure Edison selling his own design generators, he'd like that, but it just was not very practical. So the Westinghouse company would go and target these cities. And whenever they won the bid for New Orleans, that's whenever Edison started to get a little bit worried. Most of this was about ego, though. Edison believed that the reason people were trying to use AC power over his DC power was that they did not want to pay to use his patents. That it was simply a way to skirt the massive royalties that would have been his if they used his superior system. In February 1888, Edison would release an 84-page pamphlet titled A Warning from the Edison Electric Light Company and send it to newspapers and cities that might choose AC over DC. The emphasis was on safety, that these companies and cities would be on the wrong side of patent lawsuits, as well as liability lawsuits for the electrocution of a citizen, whenever that would inevitably happen.
How much of this... So you've brought up now the profit motive. Do you think that Edison was also legitimately worried about safety, or is this all a money calculation for him?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think from everything I've read about Edison, like he was kind of an egocentric person, and for him to admit that he invested so much time and money into something that was inferior would have been very hard for him. Like, it's part of the reason why he and Tesla did not get along all that well. They're both egocentric people that hated other people with egos. Yeah,
I was going to say Tesla also seemed like a guy who was not afraid to toot his own horn, and Edison probably was not about that. I'm sure he wanted guys who would put their head down and work and shut up.
Yeah, and so it was just a huge conflict of personalities along with ideologies. Tesla didn't sound like the easiest guy to work with, even if he was a complete genius, and neither did Edison. They both sounded like they were a little bit of a mess. Also, on a side note, one of the things that I learned while I was researching this is that most people aren't electrocuted. They experience an electric shock. Electrocution is a combination of electricity and execution, meaning that the person has to be killed before they are technically electrocuted.
Oh, yeah. If you don't die, you're not electrocuted. I've gotten that wrong, though. That's one of those words that I imagine is probably going to drift into meaning just whenever you've got zapped, and probably already has in a lot of circles.
Yeah, like I just didn't know that there was a technical definition that I had never met before. Because I've definitely been shocked, but I've never been electrocuted. In many ways, Edison was right about the danger. When almost 6,000 volts travel through a wire can instantaneously kill a person. New York dentist Alfred P. Southwick, inspired by seeing a vet in Buffalo use electricity to euthanize animals, was inspired to create an electric chair as a substitute for hanging. He also saw one person put their hand on a generator and were instantly killed. Like, it just was something that Southwick had seen a couple of times. Edison was consulted on making the electric chair and believed that AC power would be a perfect source to murder criminals. He even quipped that New York should hire out your criminals as linemen to the other New York lighting companies.
Now, this is interesting, Tony. This is a detail that I was not aware of. In the sort of classic boiled down Tesla versus Edison narrative, Edison is the guy who invents the electric chair, and he does it specifically to discredit Westinghouse. But you're saying he was basically a consultant who just liked the fact that it would possibly make AC look bad?
Well, he was a little bit more than a consultant on this. Like, he was the one that fronted the money to be able to buy AC dynamos to make sure that this, that he could use the negative propaganda, like, that this would create. And he also, instead of trying to make it be electrocution, he actually tried to make it be called Westinghouse. Like, he put that into papers and things like that.
Oh, boy.
Yeah. He thought that a more accurate term than electrocution would be like ampermort and some of these other terms, but he really tried to push hard for it to be called Westinghouse, which is, as far as propaganda goes, one of the better things I've ever seen.
I want to go back and find, like, a novel of the time that was just, like, when these terms were just barely being thrown around and maybe one was just as good as the other, and somebody like, this guy got Westinghouse to death.
Yeah, just see that on, like, a headline of the New York Times or something.
We should bring it back, Tony. We need to bring back Westinghouse.
I'll bring it back. Like, anytime I have opportunity to talk about people being electrocuted, I will switch it to Westinghouse.
It comes up so often in conversation.
Yeah. What's interesting is that Edison was actually against capital punishment, but because of a rash of botched hangings, he decided to help, as well as he thought that he could parlay this into some good publicity for himself.
That's an interesting collision of motivations there, I gotta say. Yeah. Like, he's like, guys, if you're gonna kill him, like, do it right. And also, this will help me out, but I don't want you to kill him.
Like, they were trying to show the effectiveness, so they would wire up, like, a dog bowl to a wire, and it would instantly have this dog just die as soon as it went to drink the water. And they were trying to show just how dangerous it was and that it could kill a human in like under a tenth of a second. But it didn't quite work out that way, and we'll get into some of that later.
Okay.
As AC started to gain ground throughout the country, demonstrations of the danger of AC began to become commonplace. Harold Brown was an electrical engineer that seemed to have no connection to Edison. He began having city orphans round up dogs for demonstrations. He would zap them with up to 1,000 volts of DC power to show that the dog would survive, whereas only 300 volts of AC would kill the dog.
Did he have like a funny mustache?
He actually did.
I can see this guy. I was like, all right, you orphans, go round up some dogs so we can talk about how AC sucks.
Yeah, this guy was just not a good person. Many people were outraged with these demonstrations and completely walked out. Some even went as far as trying to get Tammany Hall to ban him from doing these sorts of demonstrations.
Well, I'm sure that went well because those guys were paragons of virtue.
Yeah, maybe we should do an entire Bad Ideas episode on Tammany Hall someday. There's a lot of interesting stuff that happened there. One of the interesting things about this is later it was proven that there was collusion between Edison and Brown in the form of letters, the loaning of equipment, and much more. They actually paid him more than $5,000 to do this. These letters were stolen directly from the office of Harold Brown and implicated Edison as well as the treasurer of the Edison Light Company.
I don't know if you know this, Tony, but who's the dude who's like cat burglar sneaking into Harold Brown's office to get these letters out?
I wish that I could have found that in the articles I was reading. Like, I know that it was a New York newspaper man, but I did not end up writing his name down.
Well, journalism was a lot different back then.
Yeah, I feel like if you did that now, there would be a lot of lawsuits. You might make it back in like just the sheer amount of paper sold or clicks or whatever, but that's quite the move to just break into this dude's office. Also, if you're talking about collusion, why not just burn the letters? Like, there were 84 of these letters, something like that, that were just proving collusion between the two.
Yeah, I don't know. Well, you can't be burning stuff inside. You get this fire hazard.
They probably had fireplaces or like a stove.
Well, hopefully you had an electric heater at this point.
Yeah. I wouldn't have trusted an electric heater from the 1890s.
I barely trust them now.
Yeah. These ghastly tests would continue on animals as they helped the New York State develop the electric chair. Calves, horses, and other animals were used. There was even a very public execution of an elephant that had killed a few trainers in Coney Island. And basically Edison strapped a bunch of, some cuffs to the animal and was able to kill it relatively quickly with a 3,000 volt charge to the animal.
I've heard this story before. People like to be sympathetic to the elephant, but he did kill some dudes.
3 of them, actually.
Yeah.
I think the elephant's name was Topsy. But the first execution would actually be held in 1890, and based on the findings of Brown, who claimed that 1,000 volts would kill any man, William Kremler was the first to be subjected to the chair. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough to kill him, and it would take several attempts before he was finally dead. Westinghouse would later be quoted saying they would have done better using an axe. Apparently, this execution was so bad that members of the press were throwing up and just, watching this man catch fire because they had to attempt it multiple times.
Well, they probably didn't know at this point that you really wanted to put a bag over their head, too.
Yeah, I imagine that it was a pretty terrible moment, especially for William Kremler. And it was interesting because Westinghouse, trying to make sure that electrocution didn't end up becoming called Westinghouse, put up $100,000 for this guy's legal defense, trying to make sure that he wouldn't be executed, and that saying that killing people by electricity was cruel and unusual punishment. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court.
Well, killing him this way was.
Yeah, definitely that way. And I know it got better, but it never seemed like the electric chair was ever that much better than firing squad or anything like that. That's part of the reason why we don't use it today.
Hanging effectively is supposed to still be a good way to do it, but nobody wants to go to a hanging anymore.
Yeah, the only state that even has hanging on the books anymore, I think, is Utah, and they used it in the 90s the last time, I believe. While all this was happening, AC power was being adopted more and more, but Edison stuck to his dogmatic beliefs, saying that his company would never adopt AC power while he was in charge. Shortly after this statement, however, mergers started happening between the companies. Edison General Electric was controlled by several investors, including notable people like J.P. Morgan. And all of these companies, because they were just basically stealing each other's patents and suing each other over it, it created this big logjam where they were trying to just move electricity forward, but they were all screwing each other over. And basically, they just started buying each other. There were 15 major electric companies, and by the early 1890s, it would be down to 2. The Edison Electric Light Company became Edison General Electric, and then after a few more mergers, they just decided to share patents, and it became known as General Electric, or GE, and that company still exists today. With each merger, Edison found himself less and less in charge of the company he founded. In 1890, AC Power took over because of its efficiency and the fast-paced growth in technologies could handle voltage loads safer. The same year, Edison would retire from the electric business and would move on to make many more inventions. I think at this time he was specifically looking into different ways of smelting iron ore. In 1897, Edison sold the last of his stock in the Edison Electric Company. In 1908, Edison actually talked to George Stanley, son of AC transformer inventor William Stanley, and said, "Tell your father I was wrong," probably admitting he had underestimated the development potential of alternating current. So it took a while. It took a lot of weirdness with him trying to sabotage his competitors, but eventually he was able to admit that he was wrong on this one point.
I gotta say, props to Edison for developing a new worldview. It's hard enough to change your mind, right? And it did take him a while, but this is kind of a happy ending that this guy saw that this was successful and that it wasn't killing everybody under the sun like he thought it would. And after he was out of the game enough for it not to be hurting him particularly and be his skin on it, manages to disconnect himself and say, you know what, I was wrong.
Yeah, and that's over the course of 10 years, so it took a little bit of time, but there are a lot of people who are much more stubborn than that, especially when they're the ones whose inventions are basically being discounted and removed from cities. I imagine it would be pretty hard for him to see that all this time and energy he put into making better DC motors ended up being kind of fruitless. Although there are still a lot of uses for DC power, almost every electronic uses DC power. That's why you have a brick with your laptop. It's converting AC power to DC power. There's still a lot of uses for it. So it's not like it went away. It's just that you had to have a more efficient delivery system.
Yeah, it has to get to your house as AC power. Once it's there, DC is just great.
Yeah, your fridge usually runs off of it. There, lots of appliances are going to. It's still a good system. It's just we don't want power plants everywhere.
Yep.
That was actually one of the things that Nikola Tesla really wanted. He wanted to prove that you could have a power plant in Niagara Falls and have it power all of New York City. And that was one of the biggest contracts that Westinghouse ended up getting. And it kind of proved a lot of the things that Nikola Tesla had researched. As far as the bad idea here, a lot of it is that you really need to be able to look at evidence and see that sometimes there is just a better way, even if it's not the way that you've been working on for a long time. For Edison, it was very hard to admit that. He eventually would, but it ended up costing a fair amount of people their lives. It ended up costing a lot of cities wasted money in these different bids so that they would switch to DC and then have to immediately switch to AC a few years later. There was a lot that went into it, and also a lot of nastiness with sabotage between companies. But eventually it worked itself out, and it really was only over a decade. The war of currents didn't last too terribly long. I think there's actually a movie coming out about the war of currents right now. Have you seen any trailers for that?
I believe I have, yes.
It's actually just called The Current War, and it has Thomas Edison, Nikola Tesla, Westinghouse, all these guys. It's got Benedict Cumberbatch, so I'm looking forward to seeing that one and seeing if they actually got it fairly accurate or not.
I'm sure they'll make it sexier if it makes for good drama. Speaking of fun, I hope you guys had some listening to this podcast. Don't forget, if you have ideas for us to cover, you can send them to badideasshow@gmail.com or tweet us at Human Echoes on Twitter, and we'll put them in the hopper. This series of episodes, actually, about Tesla and Edison were suggested by our very good friend and supporter, Griffin, who is a patron, by the way. And if you would like to be a patron of this particular doodad and a lot of other cool stuff that we make over on YouTube, you should go to patreon.com/Human Echoes and check us out there. For as little as $2 a month, you get access to a lot of our stuff early. You get postcards. There's pins at certain tiers, a lot of really cool stuff, and it helps us keep the lights on using, of course, AC power.
Have a good one, everybody.
Take care.